Songs this morning, worshiping God because of how wonderful and how great He is, and that should help us with our contrast in viewing of ourselves with humility, and that's what this lesson will be about this morning, is daily renewing the inner man, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4:16. And part of the inner man is the heart. I mean, it essentially is the inner man. And we want to renew it with humility as we remember that we're always in the presence of God and need to be aware of how He is over us and has all authority. He created us, and many reasons we are to praise Him. As we looked at our Bible class this morning from the Psalms, we are His people. We've been redeemed. 1 Peter chapter 5 is the reading I had selected, and so pretty much that's the text I'm going to follow as far as making the points to be made in the lesson this morning. Likewise, you people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. There we see humility is expressed in two different ways. One, in our relationship with one another, so verse 5 tells us, and then quotes from Proverbs 3:34, and after that, we see our relationship to God hinges on us being humble before Him. And so we're to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. And that takes several forms and several ways in which we demonstrate that humility. And so we'll be looking at 1 Peter 5 to some degree in looking at that. But we see in verse 5, I think, the idea that being humble is an attitude. It's a mindset, but it's also a behavior, and so it would take the form of submission. And Peter has already dealt with this as a pattern throughout 1 Peter. Beginning with chapter 2, he talked about how they're to live a kind of life that would be honorable among the Gentiles. They're going to be spoken of as evildoers. They're going to be slandered, even though they're doing what is right, but they still need to glorify Him by their actions and their reaction to those slanders and other mistreatments, so that when the day of visitation comes, God would be glorified and they would glorify God because of the good works which they observe in us, our way of refraining from evil works as well because of humility. So verse 13 begins with submitting to the government. Remember, keep every law of man for the Lord's sake. And then verse 18, slaves, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not just the good and gentle. And that is the pattern of submission here. It has to do with the position, not the goodness of the person in the place of authority that determines whether or not we ought to submit to them. And that's a really difficult attitude for us to deal with in America, but that's the pattern we see. And it is here that the example of Jesus is given, who was like a lamb led before its shearers is silent, and He opened not His mouth. And so Jesus did not resist. He did not return evil words with evil words, like reviling or insulting or cursing. And He taught us the opposite in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, but He also practiced it. And the manner in which He died and the manner in which He lived, it's the same. It's consistent. And that's the way it needs to be for us as well. And even the centurion, who was a hardened, experienced soldier who had seen, I'm sure, other crucifixions, said, truly, this was a righteous man. And in Matthew's account, truly, this was the Son of God. We find then in chapter 3, wives are to be in submission to their husbands, not just the ones that are obedient, but those that are not obedient to the word, so that without a word they could win their husbands over to Christ. And likewise means the husbands are to be humble and put the needs of their wife ahead of their own desires, in verse 7 of chapter 3. And really, we're all to be submissive to one another, and that covers the last part of 1 Peter 3, verses 8 through 12. And that's what Ephesians chapter 3, verse 21 says, submitting to one another in the fear of the Lord. And it is the fear of the Lord and recognition of His greatness that actually helps us to be humble the way we ought to be humble, is to first recognize the greatness of the Lord. Peter also said, be clothed with humility. We're to be so humble that when people see us, what they see is our clothing, and that clothing is humility. So that is what he says. And when we are baptized into Christ, we have put on Christ. We are clothed with Christ. So when people see us, what should they see? They should see Christ. And by our actions, they should see Christ living in us. And I do think there's a practical application to be made by this with the words that are used in 1 Timothy chapter 2 concerning modest dress. It has to do with the mindset first, a humble mindset of not wanting to attract attention that would regulate a person choosing what to wear so that they're not trying to attract the wrong kind of attention, especially. But the article, when I wrote the article that you see in the bulletin, it bumped off the article, or is it in there? I didn't see if it's. I don't think it was still in there. The one about immodest apparel, because it's Bare, B-A-R-E season. I think it's at least on the electronic version. That's my only regret when I write an article for the bulletin. But I think it's good to be teaching in written form as well as speaking. And sometimes I feel like maybe I'm like Paul, except I don't think my letters are all that weighty, but the bodily presence is not all that impressive either necessarily. But humility does need to be such a prominent part of who we are as Christians that in every area of life, if we have that mindset, it will show in how we live, how we dress, how we talk, especially how we talk, in reaction to what other people say. And then the reason for it, as he quotes Proverbs 3:34, is because God resisteth the proud. And so we're going to talk about how God feels about humility in contrast with how God feels about pride. In Proverbs chapter 6, there's a very well-known passage about 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 that are an abomination to him. I like that play with the number 6, and then to emphasize even more, 7, which is a perfect number. And it does this a lot in chapter 30. There are 3 things in 4 that are amazing to me, and it does that several times. And the prophets, it does that a few times too. But it goes not only in the number getting greater, but it says 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. So the word for hate is actually stronger too. Abomination is like the strongest word, and it's the word detest today. A lot of people use the English word despise instead, and that's not really what despise means, but they mean detest a lot of times when they use the word despise. But God, first thing on the list, a proud look. So that's the top of the list, the beginning of it. It makes sense that it's the beginning of it because, in a way, it is the root of all sin. Genesis chapter 3, we read where, Satan appeals to Eve that, no, I mean, you cannot eat of every tree in the garden. Make it sound like you couldn't eat of any tree in the garden. Let's say there were 1,000 trees, or probably more than that. Let's say there were 1,000 trees. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, it says that all of those trees that had fruit, it was good for food, and it was good to look at. Now, when you get to chapter 3, verse 6, you see that she saw that it was good for food, good to look at, and able to make one wise. What made the tree of the knowledge of good and evil special and desirable for Eve? It wasn't just that it was good for food or that it was pleasant to look at. All the fruit of all the trees was that. But he got her attention on this because if you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil, as though that would be a good thing, which it was not, and it turned out not to be. So she appealed, her pride was what was being appealed to by Satan. And then she talked Adam into eating it, and they both ate, and of course, they didn't get the great feeling and the happiness that they thought they would get, knowing good and evil. Rather, they had a conscience now, and they realized that they were naked, and so they became ashamed. They became afraid. They tried to hide from God. So they were guilty. And so when God has them give account for it, where are you? Well, I was naked, I hid. Who told you you were naked? Did you eat of the fruit of the tree that I told you not to eat? Oh, the woman you made to be with me, she gave it to me and I ate. It says, well, the serpent beguiled me. Well, all of that is true, but making excuses doesn't change the fact. They were all trying to hide their own guilt and all that. They tried to cover themselves with fig leaves. Another great example of how men try to cover the bare minimum, and that doesn't do the job. And God made coats that would be at least knee length and covered the arm to some degree as well. Out of animal skins, it's not going to be some material that would be see-through, showing the form of the body or anything like that, but that's just another practical lesson about immodesty. When God covered them, he covered them, as opposed to their attempt to cover themselves. And there's spiritual symbolism in a lot of that historic event as well. But I do believe pride is the root of just about every sin, because it appeals to a person doing what they want to do instead of what God says to do, not trusting in God's way to achieve those things that are lawful for us to desire. Then Satan will play on that and get us to take a shortcut. It's basically what every temptation is in some way, whether it's time or effort or expense. A shortcut is a sinful decision. Not trusting God's way. That includes Jesus being tempted to just show people he's the Son of God. The angels will take care of you. You know, when he resisted those temptations, you know the first thing that happened? The angels took care of him. He'd been hungry for 40 days, and the angels took care of him. So he received that promise by doing things in God's way, and that meant more self-sacrifice, but he was still blessed. And he would be given all authority, not only on earth, that's all that Satan could offer, but all authority in heaven as well as earth. All authority on earth is nothing compared to all authority in heaven. And so Jesus didn't fall for that. And we need to remember that when we're tempted. Whatever Satan promises, it's peanuts compared to what God promises. And God is able to deliver. And Satan, even if you were to get it, you would be disappointed, just like Adam and Eve were in eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So he appeals to our pride, and it's when we make a lot of foolish decisions. A lot of kings throughout history, that's the mistakes that they made. But 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10 says, or verse 9, I think it is, says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. But what causes the love of money? Pride. You know, the status that you have, and then you can buy those things, and then everybody sees what kind of car you drive, how big your house is, and all that kind of stuff. And that's why a lot of people want to be rich, so they can push other people around or show that they're better in some way or another. And it was pride that led to this steep decline that's described in Romans chapter 1 with, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God. Neither were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God to an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. You see, the list just gets progressively worse as you go through there. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. So pride really is this resistance against submitting to God. And humility involves first submitting to God, recognizing His authority, our utter dependence upon Him. And we're to acknowledge all that when we pray to God. Recognize He's our Creator. Give thanks for what He has provided. We would have nothing without Him. We would not even exist without Him. And be thankful for even the sacrifice that Jesus made and the mercy that He shows through that. We should be able to stay humble all the time in our prayers. But there was a guy who was so proud of himself, his pride took the form of boasting within himself in the form of a prayer at the temple in Luke 18. And Jesus said, that man, he did not go to his house justified, but rather the one who just openly, honestly said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And another thing about pride is that this is the condemnation of Satan. It is the pride of Satan that caused him to fall. And that's why the warning about qualifications of elders, one is not to be a new convert, lest if he's appointed, he be puffed up with pride and fall into the same condemnation as the devil. So on the other side, God resists the proud. He detests pride. And so he's not going to give in to the proud, but show them who is in that right position. But he gives grace to the humble. I love the prayer that Solomon prayed, and the Lord loved it as well. I mean, we see how the Lord feels about it when you look at 1 Kings chapter 3. The reason that Solomon prayed what he prayed, I think partly was his dad taught him, even when he was sitting on his mother's lap, whatever you get in your life, with all you're getting, get wisdom. You see that in Proverbs chapter 4, as Solomon writes that to his son. And so when God appears to him, after he's offered 1,000 sacrifices at Gibeon, I think it was, he appears to him at night and talks about how just ask, what would you want me to give you? And Solomon said, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You've continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. He didn't earn that position. He recognizes that. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people to be numbered or counted. Well, it was be unlawful to count them, and David tried that not too long ago. Verse 9, therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? So God is great. God has been good to his father, and he knows it's because David behaved himself. By and large, there are a few exceptions, but we see he is king now, not because of anything he's done, but what God had promised David. And now he's saying, please give me wisdom to rule your people, this great people of yours. And God was extremely pleased with this. The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, because you've asked this thing and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked for riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you've not asked, riches and honor, that there shall not be anyone like you among all the kings of your days. So if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my judgments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So because he was humble and selfless in his request, he gave him that, but he also gave him everything he could have asked for through wisdom. This is a great example of what Jesus said: to whoever has, more will be given, but whoever has not, even that which he has will be taken away. Use it or lose it. So what wisdom he did have, he used, and he got more. He got more wisdom. And Peter and John, when they had boldness standing before the Sanhedrin court in Acts 4, well, they threatened them and let them go. And they prayed for boldness, and they got more boldness. And that's the way we need to be. But, you know, God feels so strongly about humility that even a wicked king like Ahab, who was the most wicked king because of Jezebel, his wife, God even rewarded Ahab's humility in 1 Kings chapter 21, because she had just taken Naboth's vineyard and gave it to him, and he was there, right there on the spot to take it. And God sent Elijah to him to tell him, because of these things, you know, you're going to be, the dogs that are licking the blood of Naboth are going to be licking your blood. And you're going to die, the kingdom's going to be taken away. And it says that he humbled himself, and then he told Elijah, now go tell him that, you know, it's not going to happen in his generation, but the generation to follow. So even a wicked king like Ahab, he showed humility, and God responded to it. That's an amazing thing. But remember what the passage says in Proverbs 3:34. God gives grace to the humble. It's not because Ahab earned it, but God is so pleased with humility that he rewarded Ahab's humility. And another example of that was Manasseh, most wicked king of all. So wicked that Judah was taken off into captivity, even though he repented. And mention of the prayer of Manasseh is mentioned in 2 Chronicles 33, being written in the book of the seers. The Orthodox Bible in Romania actually has a book in their Apocrypha called the Prayer of Manasseh. But he still had shed so much innocent blood that God did not change his mind about taking Judah away. And that's how serious the taking of innocent blood is. And I fear for our country, which has shed millions, 60 million plus more. Last count was 60 million. I think there's been more than that. It seems like the rate has slowed down a little with abortion, but you also have people in jail who are given life. Even though they've taken life, they're given life. That's the opposite of what God requires in Numbers, chapter 33. So that's a terrible thing. But the Assyrians took him into captivity. Apparently that's where he hit rock bottom, and he repented and prayed to the Lord for mercy, and he was given that, and he was freed. And the greatest faith that Jesus witnessed was a faith that was humble. That was the centurion said, just heal my servant. I will come and heal him. No, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. Just say the word and my servant be healed, because I'm a man under authority. I say something, it gets done. That's the greatest faith, Jesus said. I've not seen in all of Israel. This was a non-Israelite. He was a Gentile who had this kind of faith. It was a humble faith. A great faith is a humble faith. It's also a faith that recognizes that the authority of Christ is in the word of Christ. And that's the great lesson that we need to teach. This is the passage I like to start if I'm going to study with a Pentecostal or a charismatic. They love miracle stories. This is a great foundational miracle story because of the great lesson in it. And without humility, we cannot even enter the kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Unless one be converted and humble himself as a child, he cannot even enter the kingdom of heaven. And chapter 19 talks about that with the receiving of the children as well. And you also have the rich man who wanted to enter. He was not willing to humble himself when it came to giving up his riches. People have a tendency to trust in their uncertain riches. because that's where their status is, that's where their meaning of existence, that's how they define it. All of that is a mistake. But that's the difficulty of riches. It appeals to pride, and why it's such a temptation to go after those, even if somebody is not rich, to have a love for money. It's a desire to be proud, to better one's self and the standing of the community or in society. So, because of that, Peter went on to say, therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. And so Isaiah 6 talks about the greatness of God, and it's the first passage I look at when I think about a cure for pride is Isaiah 6. And so Isaiah is privileged to see this great scene, the Lord sitting on a throne lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, with 2 he flew. One cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. Now, just that right there, these beings are very powerful beings. We know one angel killed 185,000 Assyrians, just like that. And you read it in Isaiah, you read it in 2 Kings. Even the Babylonians recorded that historic event. The Egyptians, except they thought mice had something to do with it, but the 185,000 is still there. Herodotus, the Greek historian, also mentions that. And it's in the Assyrian account, because, they're not going to put Sennacherib in a negative light, but he boasts that he conquered all these nations and their gods and their kings. But Hezekiah, he had caged up like a bird, just like Isaiah describes. He took all of Judah, but never got to conquer Jerusalem. And so the Bible, it's borne out, what happened there. But 185,000, an angel of the Lord destroyed 185,000 Assyrians, just like that. Well, here we have these beings, the seraphim. One cried to another about the holiness of God. Holy, holy, holy. 3 times is the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies. The whole earth is full of his glory. And this is continually being stated. And their voices are so powerful that the doorposts of heaven are shaken. Can you imagine? My voice is not one that's going to do it. Even with a microphone, I can't shake the windows, much less the doorposts. But just imagine these being so great that their voices have that kind of power, how great they are. But see here, their humility, they dare not show their face. They have their faces covered by their wings, their feet covered by their wings, because they're in the presence of holy God. And that makes an impression on Isaiah. His reaction is, woe is me, for I'm undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So he sees God's greatness and God's holiness and the humility of these great, powerful, heavenly beings. And his reaction is to see his own sinfulness for what it is. This is a great cure for humility. And I suggest, this is the top pick for me to read, to renew the heart with humility. And then one of the seraphim flew to him, had a live coal, and touched his mouth with it, and now his sin is purged. Your iniquity is taken away, your sin is purged, he told him. And remember, God gives grace to the humble. If we're humble, we react like Isaiah, then we will seek that grace. We will receive that grace for purification. And then God says, whom shall I send and go before for us? And Isaiah, here am I, send me. And so he tells them, oh yeah, you're gonna tell them, but they're not gonna listen. And so once again, God's grace to the humble will be for us to have the ability to serve God in order to glorify God. And that's what we want if we're humble, because we know He's great already. It's just a matter of showing that greatness to others. It also reminds me of another thing. When we go back to 1 Peter 5, we humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, casting all our care upon Him because He cares for you. Our worries, we cast them upon Him. Like Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 says, don't worry about anything, but pray about everything. It's really what it says. With thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And that's what Peter is saying as well in 1 Peter 5 and verses 6 and 7. And then in verse 8, he says to be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary is like a lion going about seeking whom he may devour. We're warned in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Humility will help us to be on the alert so that we would not fall. Proverbs 16:18 often is quoted as being pride goes before a fall, but it's pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit leads to a fall. But somebody have abbreviated it to pride goes before a fall. So here are the 7 passages that I have listed for renewing the heart with humility. 1 a day for a week. Do this 2 weeks in a row, you'll be covered. Psalm 139, how we're skillfully and wonderfully made by God. Our existence depends upon Him. Even when we're helpless little babies inside our womb, a mother's womb, this was the case for us, just like David describes. Isaiah 6, which we've looked at, and that, like I said, I think is the best cure for pride. Luke 14, verses 7 through 14, this is where he noticed the Pharisees were trying to get the chief seats. He says, you want to go to a lower place, and then you get honor in front of everybody if the host calls you up higher up. The other side of that coin is if you take a chief seat, and then the host says, no, you go sit down here because a more important person is going to be placed up here. And Solomon had the same wisdom in the book of Proverbs too, on that same point. So that one I just couldn't leave it out. 1 Corinthians 8:1 is about how not many noble, not many mighty, not many great are called, and the wise especially in the context. And then at the end of chapter 1, I should have put it all the way through verse 31 here instead of 25, because there it quotes, let him who glories glory in the Lord, and this comes from Jeremiah 9:23 and 24. No, don't let the rich man boast, or the mighty man, or the strong man, or the wise man, or the rich man. None of those. But if anyone is going to boast, that he understands, knows me, and the kind of comforting and forgiving and merciful and long-suffering God He is. Then we have Colossians 3, the attitudes that we're to put on, the tender mercies, the kindness, the humility, and then that in action by forbearing with one another and forgiving one another if anyone has a complaint against another. And all is to be done with peace ruling our hearts, and we were to put on love as the bond of perfection. But humility is an essential ingredient of our interaction with each other there in Colossians 3. And the wisdom that is from above is first pure and then peaceable and willing to yield and easily entreated, another translation. Not showing partiality, not showing hypocrisy either, but the meekness of wisdom in our conduct needs to be seen. All of that is said by James there. And then of course 1 Peter 5, which we've kind of looked at quite a bit there. And then at the end we see we need to be following the pattern of Christ, who after He had suffered received glory and honor and those things. And we need to do the same thing. May the God of all grace, who called us to His eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. To Him be the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Because that is certainly where the glory is, where it will be. And the question is, have you submitted yourself to the authority of Jesus? He has all authority in heaven and on earth, the authority to give you everlasting life. So you need to submit to his authority and believe on him, believe he died for your sins, that he arose from the dead on the third day, all in fulfillment of the scriptures. You need to believe that he is Lord and confess him as Lord. You need to submit to his authority as Lord. That's the commitment you make in repenting. But you also need to call upon the name of the Lord by being baptized in his name in water for the remission of sins. In the likeness of his death, burial, and resurrection. That's the way you show your faith in his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And its power to save you. That's what saves you, his death, burial, and resurrection. So if you're one who needs to do that, come forward now while we stand and sing this song.
What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the